One of the classic problems when asked to talk about the role of historic religion in the academy is a methodological problem, and that is, what exactly do we mean by historic religion? Any religious movement which has the claim to the adjective historic probably has a claim to saying it's not always been that way at all times in all places. So we then end up having to take sort of a slice out of the entire history of any particular historic religious movement and say, is that what we want to claim it's about? And that's the place we have. And being someone who has critical commitments to certain things within my own tradition, I'm going to obviously argue that yes, there is an important place for historic religion in this, and the best way to figure it out is to actually review the history. And without becoming overly pedantic and taking up too much of your time, I would want to point out that the modern academy that we have in the Western world has its roots and foundations in the religious movements that existed right after the fall of the Roman Empire. Beginning with the cathedral and monastic schools, and ultimately with the establishment of the first Western university, European University of Bologna, not the first university in the world, Morocco has the claim to that, but the first one in Christendom, and then later a proliferation of universities, Paris, Erfurt, and numerous others like Oxford following after. We have a strong footing between the religious tradition and the academic tradition. Indeed, there was no real separation at all for hundreds of years. And so in some respects, one might look at the current condition of the relationship between academy and questions of faith, spirituality, and religion as an aberrational. This is actually the blip on the radar screen, perhaps. Now, whether or not it's something that's going to sustain is another question. But to say, well, this has been going on for 100 years, well, in the grand sweep of 1,000 years of higher education in the Western world, 100 years is really not that much when you think about it. I'm a very crusty historian that way. One of the folks that I would want to hold up as a potential luminary in our discussions about these things is a fellow by the name of Flavius Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, senator. Okay? Just call him Cassiodorus, it works. Cassiodorus was a statesman, he was a public official, he was also a leader and founder of a monastic school, and his great contribution in letters is something known as the Institutions on Divine and Human Letters, a remarkable book which should be held up as sort of an exemplar for what we can do as both religionists and academics at the same time. A two-part volume in which the first part deals with divine letters, those things that we should know that are theological. And the second part dealing with human letters, secular knowledge. And you see here the beginnings of the trivium and quadrivium laid out. He believed that both were absolutely necessary. You couldn't separate and compartmentalize these things. They could be discussed as categories, but it's one body of knowledge, one body of learning when you really get down to it. In this way, he follows in the footsteps of St. Augustine, who held basically the same principle. However, for some reason, a lot of people like to quote Tertullian over and over again. What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? What hath the academy to do with the church? Holding that up as what they think the Christian principle is when it comes to academic learning. And there's two problems with that. One, it's Tertullian. Okay, that's an argumentum ad hominem. That doesn't really work. I mean, it is sort of not the mainstream of Christian thought even in his own time period. And two, it's a misrepresentation of Tertullian. Tertullian never argued that there was no point in academic secular learning. His argument was against the application of that to the theological sciences. So he did try to create a firewall when he said, don't take these philosophical notions, be it Plato or Aristotle, whatever, and try to use that to explain the Christian faith, sort of compartmentalizing and creating a firewall around that. But he certainly had no objection to human learning in matters of economics or politics or other matters. Okay, so that's also important to keep in mind. As we advance with the development of universities, we eventually come to the modern age, and I think the two things that would be worthy of great discussion amongst all of us are two different events, one that happens in America and one that happens in Europe. And the one that happens in America is the rise of primitivism as an attempt to solve the ecumenical problem. And what happens in Europe is the rise of continental liberal theology. And as those two movements develop and go down, then we see a fascinating interplay between these two things. And it's all against the backdrop of the Kantian response to the 30 Years' War. So in some respects, we need to take our conversation about religion and academy, faith and spirituality, and place it within a much broader historical context and ask the question, what did the 30 Years' War do to our notions of revealed truth and our trustworthiness in it? What did Kant's response for a priori and a posteriori judgments have to do with that as well? And the critique of religion according to pure reason. And then ultimately, we have to look at particular movements in both America and Europe, the responses that arise out of that, ranging from fundamentalism to the Jesus Seminar, and how we begin to downplay distinctives in religious movements. As Harvey Cox would say, moving beyond the metaphysical understanding of religion, where it is about truth in an abstract and ontological sense, and moving toward a more pragmatic religion, where it might be about getting along more than anything else.